Hey guys, Dr. Turner back with you again. This time we'll be lecturing on uh, Daniel Dennett's second chapter, his response to Plantinga's response to his response to Plantinga's opening paper. The chapter titled Habits of Imagination and Their Effect on Incredulity. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through some of the claims that Plantinga makes and then Dennett's response to them. So first, remember, Plantinga thinks Dennett's Superman is silly, but doesn't think that theism is so silly. And the point here for Dennett is, right, we agree, Supermanism is silly. That's the whole point. What we need then instead is not just the claim that theism isn't as silly as Supermanism. We need some argument, some reason to believe that theism isn't just as silly as Supermanism, because Superman, like God, is intelligent, powerful, and good. So, what are the relevant differences that make theism a story that's not silly, but whereas Superman, all should agree, is, right? Dennett thinks that there isn't any good reason to think that theism is any less silly than Supermanism, except unless you're a theist. He thinks Plantinga thinks that theism isn't silly precisely because Plantinga is already committed to theism. And of course, if you're committed to theism, you won't think it's silly. But that's no argument for thinking that theism isn't silly, right? I mean, if there were people who were adherents to Supermanism, they wouldn't think Supermanism was silly. Okay, so he thinks it's just not true, or at any rate, there's no good reason to think that Supermanism is any less silly than theism. And just to highlight this point, he thinks, look, we can add details to the Supermanism story that make it just as plausible as theism. For example, we can add details that have to do with Superman's birth date. Remember, Plantinga said, look, Superman's not been around long enough to be responsible for the evolutionary process, given that Superman was created in the 1930s. Well, so what? We can change the date of Superman's birth to be, millions and millions of years ago. We can increase his power and so on. We can increase his knowledge. That is, just add to his relevant skill set and so on, okay? To make it more plausible, if you will, a story, Supermanism. So if we can do that, then there's no in-principle reason, Dennett thinks, for thinking that theism is something that's more plausible or should be favored as a story over something like Supermanism. And if not, since everybody agrees Supermanism is silly, all should agree then that theism is silly. All right, the second claim Plantinga makes is that, so he says, Dennett's claim that naturalism is tacitly assumed in the sciences is obviously false. But Dennett disagrees. He thinks it's not obviously false. Naturalism is the null hypothesis. That's the starting point. Physicists walk into their lab, say, or biologists or whatever, to run an experiment, and none of them have to say, oh, unless God, I expect this or that thing to happen, unless God chooses to intervene. No, they presuppose that there won't be a God or anything like God intervening in their experiment. Okay? So that's what Dennett says. Now, if we're thinking in Plantinga's shoes here, which you should always kind of be thinking in the shoes of the opponent of the chapter that you're reading. So when you're reading Plantinga, think like Dennett. And when you're reading Dennett's chapters, think like Plantinga. So here, one thing we would want to pause and ask if we were Plantinga, reading through Dennett's chapter here, is, let's suppose it's true that scientists don't walk into their labs and presuppose that God will intervene. Or let's put it differently, they presuppose God won't. Why should that mean that that's a naturalistic assumption? Okay, remember, naturalism is the idea that there's no God or anything like God, that there's just the material universe. Why should we think that walking into a science lab, presupposing God won't intervene with my experiments, why does that amount to the claim or entail the claim that there's no God or anything like God? Okay, it's not obvious that it does. All right, well, one reason Dennett thinks that that is a naturalistic assumption, he's referring back to this guy, J.B.S. Haldane, who is a scientist. back in the earlier part of the 20th century. He says this: "My practice," this is Haldane speaking, "my practice as a scientist is atheistic. That is to say, when I set up an experiment, I assume that no God, angel, or devil is going to interfere with its course. And this assumption has been justified by such success as I have achieved in my professional career." In other words, his assumption has always been right. There hasn't been a God or angel or devil that's interfered with his experiments. "I should therefore be intellectually dishonest if I were not also atheistic in the affairs of the world." In other words, I walk into a lab, I presuppose God, or that neither God nor anything like God will intervene, and I've always been right about that. So I should expect the same thing when I walk out of the lab, that neither God nor anything like God will intervene. And lo and behold, my everyday experience has shown that to be true. At least that's what he thinks. Now, a question again: if you're reading this chapter, we can ask this. Just pause and ask a question: why should we think that presupposing that neither God nor anything like God is going to interfere with your experiments, that's an atheistic starting point, where atheism is the denial that God exists? Why should it be thought of as atheistic to walk into a lab and presuppose that God or angels or whatever aren't going to interfere with the goings on in the lab? Okay. Secondly, Dennett Dennett just claims, and he's right, that of course science allows the possibility that there could be demonstrations of the miraculous, i.e., demonstrations of the principles or violations, the principles of naturalism to be violated. But as far as Dennett is concerned, that sort of thing has never happened. I guess he assumes, this is going back to David Hume, who's an 18th century Scottish philosopher, that, people report all these miracles, but Dennett doesn't have any experience of those, and neither did Hume, and neither do many others. These alleged violations of naturalistic functions of the universe. Okay, science allows that those things could happen, right? That we could demonstrate that somehow the laws of nature or something have been violated, but you don't have any demonstrations of those, not done by scientists anyway. So no good reason to think that those things have in fact happened. And then Dennett starts talking about this principle called the non-overlapping magisteria principle. It's not because Plantinga brings it up, it's because he thinks there are some upshots of Plantinga's argument that seem similar to this principle of this NOMA principle, non-overlapping magisteria. The NOMA principle is this idea that there is no conflict between science and religion because they don't talk about the same stuff. They're covering different realms of inquiry, you might say. And if so, they're not going to come into conflict. That's what NOMA says, all right? But Dennett thinks that's false. He thinks that, no, science and religion do overlap. Evolutionary biology, for example, given its naturalistic presuppositions, he thinks strikes squarely against the theistic belief, of course, which is the denial of naturalism that says evolution has a purpose. And so, well, if evolution were to happen, it would have a purpose. Dennett thinks that theory is in conflict with evolutionary biology. So, if so, then there's a conflict between religion and science, all right. Worse, he thinks that there's a sociological problem that would happen if NOMA is false, and actually has happened because people appeal to, even if they don't know it, something like the principle of non-overlapping magisteria. He thinks the belief that NOMA is true, ordinary rate, even if you don't realize that's what's going on, the pre-commitment to NOMA is potentially damaging to science, and we see this when people who argue for that intelligent design is a legitimate sort of science and ought to be taught in schools alongside evolutionary biology, or maybe even worse, the claim that evolutionary biology is a religion of its own, so it ought not to be taught in public schools. Right? So the claim that these two enterprises in questioning how things work, the claim that those things don't overlap at all has led people to go, well, if they don't overlap and they're not in conflict, then intelligent design is just as valid of an enterprise as evolutionary biology. And if that's true, then we ought to teach them both. And if you favor the one, if you favor evolutionary biology over intelligent design, that's you favoring one bit of investigation over another. What could the explanation for that be other than religious preference? And if that's what it is, since there's a separation of church and state, allegedly, we ought to, if we can't have intelligent design, then we ought not have evolutionary biology. Okay, so he thinks these are upshots of the claim that there is no conflict between religion and science, which he thinks is just an appeal to this principle of non-overlapping magisteria. He thinks that's super problematic. And then finally, with respect to Plantinga's main argument, which was the evolutionary argument against naturalism, remember that the crux of the argument had to do with this idea that naturalism entails materialism about humans, materialism being the view that humans just are material objects with no soul or spirit or immaterial mind or something like that. And the idea that if materialism is true and evolution is true, given that evolution only cares about adaptive behavior, it'll only care about whether or not the structures in our brain cause adaptive behaviors. And where beliefs are thought of as brain structures, neuronal structures or something, it seems like the content of those structures, the immaterial, you might say, belief content, like the belief that you're watching this lecture right now, seems to be irrelevant to the evolutionary process. And so that would mean the truth is irrelevant to the evolutionary process. And so the truth is irrelevant to the belief's fitness, that is, adaptive fitness for survival. So that's what Dennett questions. Is the truth of the contents of our beliefs irrelevant to our beliefs being fit for survival? He thinks the answer to that is no. And this is a direct quote I have on the slide from the book. He says, "It is precisely the truth-tracking competence of belief-fixing mechanisms that explains their adaptivity in the same way that it's the blood-pumping competence of hearts that explains theirs. Hearts are for circulating the blood, and brains are for tracking the relevant conditions of the environment and getting it right." In other words, look, if I ask you what the human heart is for, you'll say to pump blood. If I ask you what's the human brain for, it might be for many things, but one thing it's for is for tracking the truth. That's just what brains are for. That's what Dennett's arguing. Now again, if we are thinking and planting his shoes as we read, let's just pause and think about this. Of course, it's true that as a matter of fact, brains track the truth. That's what they're for. And I doubt very much that Plantinga would disagree. Nobody should disagree with that. If you ask what's the purpose of the brain, very easily we can respond to, maybe there's many things, but one thing that its purpose is to track the truth. Okay? The question, the relevant question then, is not what's the purpose of the brain. The question is, what are the odds that that would be what brains do, given the truth of naturalism and evolution? In other words, given the evolutionary process that's not guided by God or something with an intention for human brains to track the truth. What are the odds that we'd have brains at all, much less brains that are for the purpose of truth tracking? That's the question. All right, then Dennett considers this question that this is still related. So Plantinga asks, what would the probability on naturalism and evolution be that the shapes on the calculator screen would punch out English sentences that express truth? Well, now that's assuming that the calculators weren't designed, right? Remember, Plantinga is like, here's the reason calculators last only if their truth tracking is precisely because they're designed to track the truth. Suppose they weren't, though, what would be the odds that they spit out true sentences? Well, Dennett's response is it depends. It just depends on what's required for those calculators to be fit given their environment, right? Suppose they're meant to do things that iPhones do. Well, of course, in order for those things to be reliable, the probability that they spit out true information would have to be very high, given the point of calculators doing what iPhones do. All right. Now he agrees that that's a tall order, right? That's a tall order. That's a big ask. But of course, who cares? Is his question. So what? The fact that it's a tall order that these calculators would end up spitting out true sentences doesn't mean that that's impossible, that kind of thing should happen, right? And he's right. It's not impossible. Obviously, it's not impossible. Where impossibility has to do with matters of logic. There's nothing contradictory about saying, these calculators could evolve, if you want to call it that, in such a way as to track the truth in a reliable way. Okay. And one example of this that he gives is the honey guide, which is a kind of bird that reliably, just as a matter of fact, leads humans to fresh honey. Okay, and it's only because humans see what's going on that we can interpret the honey guide's actions as a lead to fresh honey. But just as a matter of fact, that's what honey guides have evolved to do. So just because that happens, just because honey guides lead humans to fresh honey, and it took intelligence to see that that's what honey guides were in fact doing, why should that imply that intelligence is required to make honey guides such that they reliably track the destination of fresh honey? We should grant that it does take intelligence to figure out that that's what honey guides are doing, that they are showing us, just as a matter of fact, where fresh honey is. But why should we think it follows from that those things were intelligently designed to do that? There's no obvious reason to think that that's true. So similarly, why think that truth tracking couldn't have evolved, right? So just as a matter of fact, our brains track the truth. As a matter of fact, it takes intelligence to see that that's what our brains do. Why should it follow from that intelligent design was required to make it the case that our brains track the truth? So again, if we are reading this chapter in Planting His Shoes, we should pause and ask this question. Is that really what Plantinga claims? Does he claim that truth tracking couldn't have evolved? I think the answer you're going to get is no. He doesn't argue against the truth of evolution at all. And he's not arguing against the truth of our cognitive apparatuses being reliable. And he's not arguing against the claim that the reliability is a product of evolution. So it's not, if that's right, it's not super clear how the honey guide example is supposed to rebut or respond to Plantinga's objections just yet. Okay, because instead of claiming that it's not the case that evolution is responsible for our brains being truth tracking, the question is, what are the odds that evolution would do that if it was unguided? If it's guided, and God or something like God has as its intention brains that track the truth, well, the odds are really high. But given that if the evolutionary process really is blind, what are the odds that our brains would reliably track the truth? Or think about the honey guide. What are the odds that the honey guide would reliably track the truth to honey, given an unguided process? Got to be pretty low. Okay, so there's the end of that lecture. Next, we'll think about Plantinga's response, which is his final chapter of the book. Okay, see you then.